All right, welcome everyone. I'm Jason Landrum, a Senior Program Officer with the Lenfest Ocean Program, and I'm so happy that you've joined us today for this virtual discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to first offer a land acknowledgement. From the coast to the deep water and across boundaries and borders, we would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the indigenous peoples that have called these lands and waters home since time immemorial. Washington, D.C. sits on the ancestral lands of the Anacostans, also documented as the Nacotchtank, and the neighboring Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. You'll be meeting folks throughout the event, but I wanted to start with introducing the Lenfest team that is here today. Emily Knight, Kayla Ripple, and Vicki Bell. Emily and Kayla will be sharing links and resources in the chat, and Vicki is handling our social media, as well as the recording of today's discussion, which we'll share widely shortly following this event. A few notes on logistics. All attendees are muted. With so many attendees, we wanted to minimize any audio disruptions during the event. We have a full agenda today, and we'll try to host a live Q&A session at the end if time allows. For those who do have questions, please submit them in the designated Q&A chat area throughout the event. Please also share resources or comments in the chat area, and we will track those as well. Today, we stand at the precipice of a critical time and opportunity for advancing equitable, inclusive, and evidence-based ocean biodiversity management, protection, and restoration across America. But we can only achieve this by listening, working together, and contributing in our own unique, special ways. For our part at the Lenfest Ocean Program, we have been funding projects since 2020 in our Marine Biodiversity Dialogues portfolio, which aims to strengthen engagement between experts, managers, practitioners, and rights holders to transform different knowledge systems into meaningful actions. Drawing on this work, Gabrielle, Canonico, Emmett Duffy, and Lauren Wenzel, who we will hear from in just a minute, wrote the National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy to offer a vision for how communities across the United States can bring diverse knowledge about ocean life to action for the benefit of all. And if you're looking for some kernels of inspiration about how you and your community can contribute, please check out a blog I recently wrote that offers some initial ideas on how to do so. Today's event is the second in a series of online discussions that aim to elevate different voices at the local, state, and regional levels to feed directly into a national dialogue on this topic. At the first event in August, we heard from local leaders from Alabama, Maryland, and Washington State to discuss the essential ingredients and partnerships necessary to make the U.S. National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy successful on behalf of coastal communities. For today's session, we've invited state and regional managers and practitioners from across the country to reflect on what those coastal communities are calling for and to share their own perspectives and ideas on how to advance this national level strategy and turn its goals into on-the-water actions. With that, I will invite my colleague Emily Knight to provide some brief intro remarks, followed by remarks by Gabrielle, Emmett, and Lauren, and then on to our very distinguished and esteemed panel. Thanks again for joining us, and Emily, take it away.
Sure, and I will be very brief. And please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and where you're coming from. I am the Senior Outreach Manager for the Lenfest Ocean Program, and I've been working with Jason, Emmett, and Gabrielle to implement outreach for Marine Biodiversity Dialogues. As Jason mentioned, we've been supporting Marine Biodiversity Dialogues since 2020. And one of the many things we've learned over the course of this journey is the need to connect the local to the national. What do I mean by that? Simply put, how does a National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy help a region, or a state, or a town, or very importantly, a frontline coastal community? So, Marine Biodiversity Dialogues, the project, as well as our outreach around it, is trying to reflect that. So Marine Biodiversity Dialogue started as a national assessment in US waters of how much marine biodiversity there is and where it is. Now it's taking that national level assessment into 3 regions, the Gulf of Mexico, Chesapeake Bay, and the Puget Sound, and using conceptual stakeholder mapping to systematically incorporate the needs, inputs, and values of local communities. On the outreach side, this is why we're here, with state managers and practitioners from across the country to discuss their work, why sustaining marine biodiversity is critical to their communities, and how the national level can empower their efforts. We also held that virtual panel on August 7th. The recording is already in the chat, featuring community members that are involved in marine biodiversity dialogues. And I'll quote Tiara Thomas, member of the Piscataway Conoy Tribe and the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs, Maryland, my home state. Quote, "My people think about the health of the tributaries to the Chesapeake Bay to the sea. It's all connected. We're all connected," end quote. Similarly, what we do in DC, it can either help or it can hurt or just feel far removed from states and communities. This time, let's make sure it helps. And so, in conclusion, go Orioles. And with that, I will turn it over to Emmett Duffy of the Smithsonian Institution, Gabrielle Canonico of the U.S. Integrated Ocean Observing System, and Lauren Wenzel of the National MPA Center. Take it away.
Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'd like to first start by thanking our colleagues at Lenfest for organizing today's webinar, along with Lauren and colleagues, and for supporting the important work that's brought us here. And especially to thank each of our speakers today, who are really the stars of the show here, and bring a wealth of experience and diverse perspectives on how we can protect and sustainably use ocean biodiversity. And who also illustrate the diverse roles that states, tribes, territories, and other communities are taking and showing us the way to take action. So our panelists will introduce themselves in just a moment. I want to provide briefly some background about the National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy and the federal government's role in implementing it. So the White House released the strategy in June of this year, and the sort of overarching aim is to advance both the science needed and the stewardship action we need to make sure that both ocean life and the people who depend on it, which is all of us, continue to thrive now and in future generations. This strategy actually represents, I think, a major milestone. It's the first time that the federal government, or federal agencies, in consultation with the public, have come together to create a common vision for ocean biodiversity conservation and the science that is needed to support it. So the strategy represents a roadmap to strengthen the capacity we already have for ocean biodiversity research, monitoring, and importantly, to apply that knowledge toward important management goals, as well as to expand coordination between the many public and private organizations and communities who live and work with ocean life. So the goal is that we work together to enhance, rebuild, and sustain the life of the ocean and the people of the ocean, and the many benefits that we draw from that. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Gabrielle Canonico, who can say a little bit more about the details.
Yeah, thanks, Emmett. And thank you to Lenfest for hosting us, and to so many wonderful participants. I'm excited to see the introductions in the chat. So I'm glad those are pouring in. So the strategy as a document has three goals. They are focused around driving delivery of ocean biodiversity knowledge at the national scale, strengthening tools and institutions to deliver ocean biodiversity knowledge, and protecting, conserving, and restoring, and also sustainably using ocean biodiversity and the life in our ocean coast and Great Lakes. And that piece is important. The strategy covers biodiversity of all U.S. ocean waters, where we've defined ocean to include oceans, coasts, estuaries, Great Lakes. Biodiversity includes the variety of life at all levels. So genes, species, habitats, ecosystems. From microbes to whales, we've taken the broadest definition. And also, it aims to capture the holistic sense of living nature. People are a part of nature. So a very comprehensive definition of biodiversity. Following the publication of the strategy, a federal writing team is now developing an implementation plan that will guide federal action for implementation. But this is not just a federal initiative. We will only succeed, as you've heard, in this huge challenge if we're working closely with all of you. And so we really want to hear and to listen to your diverse voices incorporate your perspectives, your histories, your ways of knowing, and to understand how to align across different types of governance and different needs for engagement. We would also like to hear now or later your ideas or actions, those that you would like to take to entrain your communities in advancing the goals of the strategy. So opening this up for you to please reach out to us even after this event today. We're all in this together. And now I have the pleasure of transitioning to Lauren Wenzel, who is your moderator for today.
Thanks, Gabrielle. Hi, I'm Lauren Wenzel. I'm the director of NOAA's National Marine Protected Areas Center. And just building on what our speakers have said, we are really excited about having a dialogue around how we can bring all these different voices and perspectives and ways of knowing into the challenge of conserving biodiversity so that it can continue to sustain us. And so with that, it's my pleasure to turn to our panel. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. And I would like to ask each of you to tell us your name and where you're from, but also tell us about your role in managing, protecting, and restoring biodiversity in your region or state, and tell us why marine biodiversity is important to you. So I'm going to ask Jenn to go first.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. My name is Jenn Eckerle. I serve as the Deputy Secretary for Oceans and Coastal Policy for the California Natural Resources Agency. I also serve as the Executive Director of the California Ocean Protection Council, otherwise known as OPC. OPC is a cabinet-level, non-regulatory state agency, and we were established to protect California's coast and ocean. And we do that by advancing innovative science-based policy and management. We make strategic investments in things including on-the-ground restoration or research and monitoring. And we catalyze action through partnerships and collaboration. We serve as the governor's advisor on coastal and ocean policy in California. Our work is really focused on 4 key goals: climate change, equity, biodiversity, and a sustainable blue economy. And we're also leading the state's 30 by 30 efforts for coastal waters. I also serve on the Federal Marine and Coastal Area-Based Management Advisory Committee to support science-based protection, restoration, and conservation and management for the coast and ocean nationally. And marine biodiversity is important to me because I have had a deep and personal connection to the ocean for as long as I can remember. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenn. All right, it's my pleasure now to go to Kawika. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Aloha mai kako, wau no ke ia o Kawika Winter, he keke o ka aina wau no Hawaii, ho maka ana au I ku ha'i o lelo, maka o lelo makuhine o ka aina, I ola ka makuhine, makuhine o lelo ka aina. So welcome everybody, thank you for having me. My name is Kawika Winter. I'm starting out my introduction in the Hawaiian language so that we be heard and live in these spaces. I am currently the director of the He'eia National Estuarine Research Reserve on the island of Oahu, which is a co-stewardship endeavor between NOAA, the University of Hawaii, and the indigenous community of He'eia, Native Hawaiian community. Happy to be here and share a little bit of our perspectives of some indigenous and Pacific Islander perspectives of relationship to the ocean and the biodiversity therein. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Okay, Dylan?
Hello, everyone. My name is Dylan McDowell. I'm the Executive Director of the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, or NCEL. I grew up on the Oregon coast and started volunteering at the Oregon Coast Aquarium when I was young. And so the ocean has always been something I've been really passionate about. And so being able to look at policy solutions for that is something that drives me. I'll briefly say that NCEL is an organization. We work with a network of about 1,300 state lawmakers across the country, and we serve as a hub for them to access best practices, connect with peers in other states, and really pursue the best policies possible. We don't lobby, we're nonpartisan, but it's really about resourcing and supporting state lawmakers who often don't have a lot of staffing capacity or time. And so taking those lessons learned from across the country so it can inform better policy at the state level and hopefully inspire federal action.
Thank you. Chapa, would you like to go next?
Sure. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Ruperto Chaparro. I am the Puerto Rico Sea Grant Director. I am from Puerto Rico. And the Sea Grant program, we have our mission is to promote the wise use of coastal and marine resources. Our program works in Puerto Rico and in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And we have been in Puerto Rico for close to 50 years. I have been with the program for 35 years. I started as a marine agent working in marine recreation and coastal tourism. And now I have been for the last 15 years the Sea Grant Director. And I think biodiversity is very important because just with an example of what happens to the sea urchins in Puerto Rico, that most of them died about 20 years or 25 years ago. And since then, we've been having trouble with the coral reefs because they were the ones that maintain the balance between marine grasses and the corals. So I think biodiversity is very important because all organisms are related.
Thank you. Michelle.
Thank you. My name is Michelle Duval. I am a fisheries management and policy consultant, and I am currently a member of the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council from the great ocean state of Pennsylvania. But I grew up in the Great Lakes state of Michigan and then spent another 25 years living in North Carolina. So I've been surrounded by an ocean of some sort for all of my life. And, I spent 10 years working for an environmental nonprofit, bird dogging fisheries managers before actually becoming one for about 11 years, where I represented the state's interests on the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council for a while prior to relocating to Pennsylvania. And so I've spent a lot of time talking to fishermen and fisheries participants and people in the fisheries space. And so, and thinking about, integration of ecosystem approaches for management of our fisheries. And so marine biodiversity is important to me because climate change is, forcing changes in regional biodiversity that fishermen are seeing firsthand on the water. And so, protecting that biodiversity is really important because it has the potential to, profoundly affect the economies that are so important to our coastal communities and our fishing communities. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers. And I know we have another speaker, Vera Metcalf from the Eskimo Walrus Commission. And I believe she's having some technical difficulties. I'm not seeing her yet, but hopefully she'll be able to join us and we'll ask her to introduce herself when she does. But for now, I'd like to ask any of the speakers who'd like to comment. As you heard from the introduction, there was a part one of this webinar series where we heard from some folks involved in coastal and marine management in 3 different geographies in Alabama, Maryland, and Washington State about their work on marine biodiversity and why it was important to them. Any thoughts people would like to share on anything that really resonated with you from that first discussion that you'd like to reflect on? Yeah, Michelle.
I'll take the bait. So I think, for me, I think both, I think it was Richard mentioned ensuring that our decisions were science-based, and also Jody talked about, integrating different systems of knowledge and, not just traditional systems that we might use, like a stock assessment, for example, but also, community knowledge. And I think, and that how important this is to bringing people into the biodiversity dialogue. And so I think, as I think about my space in here and where I've operated, one of the things about climate change is that it's really kind of stressing our traditional science enterprise. And so, which generally relies on a very long time series of statistically rigorous, data collection that have been, developed over long periods of time. And so, these shifts in species distribution, which are occurring, which lead to these shifts in regional biodiversity, are straining how some of that science is interpreted, the availability of that science. And so I think as climate change continues to affect species distributions and biodiversity, I think we're going to really need to focus on integrating those different knowledge systems in order to so, especially ones that are more readily available in real time, although they might not be, I think, considered by some scientists as statistically rigorous, they're incredibly important to sort of ground truthing what is going on out there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think those are some great points. Climate change is definitely going to require us to up our game in terms of bringing all the sources of knowledge that we have to bear on these decisions. Dylan, yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think part of this is a kudos to all of you of just assembling an incredible first panel, because one of the areas I feel like this topic really excels is thinking about co-benefits. And the plan has done a very good job of thinking about, or the strategy thinking about co-benefits as part of the underpinnings of this. And I think about as some of this moves forward politically, it's so important to have these conversations transcend political boundaries and discussions. And I think the panel you all brought together does a really good job of that, having educators and fishermen and folks from more of a business background and indigenous perspectives, cultural lenses, all these different things. And to me, it just really reflects the kind of conversations we need to have in state houses, at the federal level, in these rooms, to show that there's really something in this for every single person that's part of a coastal community, coastal state, or really just in the US. Because even as you said, in the ocean loving state of Pennsylvania, there's a lot of work to be done and connections to be made.
Yeah, thanks. Great points. Okay, I think what we're going to do is go ahead and ask some questions to specific panelists, and then we will have time for a broader set of questions after that. So I'm going to start with Jenn. Jenn, California has a long history of bringing knowledge to action to protect diverse ocean resources. And you have your state 30 by 30 initiative, and obviously long history with your MPA network. And I'm interested in hearing what kinds of lessons you've learned through your management that you think could apply to this broader national conversation.
Thanks, Lauren. I have the rest of the time, right? Just kidding.
We'll have to get the book out.
Just kidding. I came up with a little bit of a top 8. I don't have a top 10, but just some lessons that bubbled up for me when thinking about this question. So number one is in California, having really strong leadership and champions at the highest levels of government and across, all of society was really important. So for our marine protected area network, we had landmark legislation that required protection of marine life and habitats and adaptive management over time. For 30 by 30, we had an executive order from the governor that directed us to do this conservation work. And then that was followed up by legislation from that codified those 30 by 30 goals into state law. We also have, a really incredibly engaged public and community that is interested in and cares deeply about protecting the coast and ocean in California. So that's really important. Number 2, setting really clear conservation goals and then grounding implementation in strong science. So California has a network of 124 science-based, ecologically connected marine protected area network. When we were designing the MPAs, we had really clear science guidance to help us meet the ecological goals. So that included, how big our MPAs needed to be, how close together they needed to be to have that connectivity. And then we also had a community-driven process to help establish the network. And now we've established this really strong management program to maximize our benefits and also ensure that ongoing durability in the protection. And that includes baseline and long-term monitoring to collect data that will help us understand how our MPA is performing and how do we adaptively manage them over time. Similarly, our 30 by 30 strategy has a really strong definition of what a conserved area is. These are areas that provide durable protection and provide ecosystem level benefits. So as we're thinking about this work and implementing 30 by 30 for the coast in California, We're using international scientific guidance. We're adapting it for California, and that's going to help create a decision framework for us to understand, to the extent to which existing management measures in the ocean are meeting that definition of conserved, and what are the tools we have to further strengthen biodiversity protection. Number 3, we have got to create space for all voices to reflect the breadth of perspectives and knowledge. So tribal consultation and community engagement has been really essential to understand needs and priorities in California, and to make sure that our actions are elevating the core principles of equity and tribal stewardship, and being intentional and creative about the ways that we solicit input has been key. So we've used listening sessions and roundtables and formal and informal tribal consultation and other mechanisms. And we still have so much work to do in this space, but we have made some really meaningful progress. Number 4, we need to prioritize and leverage investments. So over the last several years, California has really had, unprecedented funding to support biodiversity conservation and restoration and protection. We had targeted funding specifically for California Native American tribes. And this funding really provided an opportunity to kind of leverage federal and private dollars to really increase our reach and our impact. 5, we need to innovate, and we need to be comfortable learning by doing. So as many of you know, between 2014 and 2019, Northern California experienced devastating loss of bulk kelp with consequences for ecosystem health and for local economies. So the Ocean Protection Council invested in research and pilot restoration projects to really understand the optimal conditions for kelp growth and persistence, and that's informing our strategies to support kelp recovery and resilience. And we just have to be comfortable, testing things out and having some things fail to really understand what is going to work. Number 6, we have to go together. We cannot do this work alone. We need to establish and sustain the social infrastructure that's going to generate ownership and stewardship over the long term. It's really important to build a network that leverages resources and expertise, from where I sit in the government all the way down to, community residents. 7, don't get hung up on the perfect. This work is really hard. There are a lot of people who care about the health of the ocean, but we come to it from different perspectives. So it's really important to have science driving our actions, but sometimes we need to compromise or take a phased approach in order to achieve our meaningful conservation. And then finally, we need to learn from others. So California's NPA network and our 30 by 30 initiative are really models for ocean conservation. We're going to be going to COP16 in a couple of weeks to share our success in California, talk about the value of subnational governments in meeting our global biodiversity targets. But just as importantly, we're going to be there to listen and learn from others around the world, because we still have a lot to learn to strengthen and improve this work. So I'm really happy to be here today to share some of these lessons, but to also learn from this esteemed panel and the work that we're going to continue to do together. So that's my top 8.
Thank you so much, Jen. I feel like I just got a crash course in California ocean management. That was fantastic. So the next question is for Kawika. You've spoken for a long time about the importance of advancing community-driven collaborative management and elevating Indigenous agency and knowledge to guide that work. So from your experience, how can implementation of the National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy include those concepts? And what are ways that can happen?
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. I want to hone in on that term right there, Indigenous agency, because it's a term that most people won't be familiar with. But if we look at agency as the ability of people to speak in their own self-interest, when we're speaking of Indigenous agency, and speaking of the ability of Indigenous people to speak in their own self-interest. And because Indigenous people, as a broad generalization, tend to exist in a worldview that sees humanity and nature as a part of the same system, Indigenous agency is engaging in the relationships that perpetuate that worldview. And so that's a really important interface for this national strategy. And I want to commend those that have put this together for calling out the need to include Indigenous knowledge, as the Biden administration has indicated in its memos, and the context of research, policy, and decision-making. All that said, I don't see too much evidence that Indigenous people were actually at the table when this was drafted. I say that because a lot of the framework of this strategy seems to be constructed in that worldview that sees humanity as separate from nature, and that's not the way we see the world. As an example of that, there tends to be this false dichotomy between extraction and protection, and we need to engage in protection because there's so much extraction happening. But there's other ways to look at it, right? And even in the example that is provided in the strategy of engaging with Indigenous knowledge, it's within the context of protection. So it's really important, I think, that we, as we develop these strategies and implement them, we understand that some of the peoples, Indigenous peoples, and even local communities don't necessarily live in that worldview. And if we can do away with that false dichotomy between extraction and protection, then what else is there? If we dissolve those false dichotomies, we can see that there are other ways to engage with the ocean and its biodiversity. There are reciprocal relationships that we speak of. There are existential relationships, you know, from the perspective of a lot of the people in Oceania, specifically Pacific Islanders. We are the ocean and the ocean is us. There's no separating the two, and the health of the ocean is our health, and vice versa. So I would just hope, you know, as we implement these things, I did see in goal number 3 in the strategy, it talked about restoration. And I think that is really the crux of where my work comes in, because we work within the context of biocultural restoration. That's the term of art that we use. So biocultural is a term that acknowledges the relationships between humanity and nature in a single system, not two things in two separate systems. And so when we speak of biocultural restoration, we're speaking first of restoring those relationships that exist between us, and in this context, between us and the ocean's biodiversity. Now, some of our communities and families have never lost those relationships. Others have. And so when we engage in this biocultural restoration, which a large part of my research program aims at supporting, what is that? What are the impacts of that? And so we usually speak of human impacts on the ocean as negative, but impacts aren't always negative. So our research program is really designed at understanding all impacts, including the good ones that humans have on ocean biodiversity and other forms of biodiversity. So really, when we look at this ocean strategy, that really is the nexus that we are going to be engaging on, that restoration angle, but again, from within a different worldview that this strategy seems to be written in, and we do it from within a worldview where we see humanity and nature as a part of a single system. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kawika. And I think that by reminding us of the connections between people and nature, we really see the opportunities that brings to kind of think about the relationship differently and the opportunities it offers. So really appreciate that. I'm going to turn now to Dylan. And Dylan, you know, state legislatures are laboratories for policy experimentation. And, you know, some are doing some really interesting work in environmental conservation. And so I'm interested in hearing an example of a state level biodiversity strategy that could be adopted by other states or scaled up at a national level that might drive implementation of biodiversity conservation in the ocean.
Thank you for that, Lauren. And I'm going to pick up a little bit on some of the work that Jenn was talking about of really that lesson sharing and best practices. I think that's just so important and so vital. And as Jenn mentioned, California has really been a leader when it comes to things like 30 by 30 conservation and specifics like definitions in some of these policies. But I'm actually going to provide 3 quick examples, because I think one of the benefits, as you mentioned, of states is that they can serve as a laboratory where you have 50 states trying 50 different things that can be replicated, expanded, and ultimately scaled. There is never really one size fits all directly that you can take across the country, but I think you take a lot of components, and that's where our organization tries to figure out what are some of those best practices, things working well, all the way from the definition level to the large scale implementation of programs and the structure of those. So a few I just want to highlight really quickly. I think a theme that we're seeing is that there's a lot of work been done on the terrestrial or land-based conservation in recent years. And so the ocean space, I think there's a lot we can learn and pull from on that terrestrial conservation. There's also opportunities to integrate the two. A good example of this is the Florida Wildlife Corridors Act from 2021. This was focused on funding green infrastructure and wildlife habitat. And this was a bipartisan, bicameral bill. And I think there's a real opportunity and interest in expanding that into the marine ecosystems, whether directly through wildlife connectivity or thinking about replicating these programs. And I think that's something that's really important where we can build on existing successes. The second I want to share and highlight is the Massachusetts, and they had an executive order 618 to establish planning and promoting of a biodiversity conservation and goals for 2030, 2040, and 2050. And I think what's really important to acknowledge and bring here is they have what they're calling a whole of government approach. And so this is including the agencies looking at their planning, looking many years out. It's including really outreach and communications with a whole variety of stakeholders, community groups, communities with cities, etc. And this is something we're seeing as a really strong asset of the policy development that they're starting to work on in their kind of roadmap. I think something that's really important that's included there is a focus on the blue economy, which is a term that we're seeing used more and more in a lot of states. So thinking about industries, fishing, ocean tourism, offshore wind, etc. And so making sure that that's brought into this conversation and that we're not having separate conversations about biodiversity and economics, but really, once again, how do we bring these co-benefits together? Finally, I want to highlight Washington, where they had a bill in 2022 to conserve and restore 10,000 acres of eelgrass and kelp forests. And this is really exciting because it sets a goal, so it's a starting point, but it's already been pivotal for thinking about funding conversations and implementation, state planning. And it really starts to get at the importance of kelp and eelgrass as something that's important for both habitat, for cultural usage, sequestering carbon, all these different co-benefits. And so I think all three of these states continue to advance different areas that we can pull on, replicate, and grow as we look at these efforts across the country. And hopefully we'll see continued state action on this and ultimately more federal lessons drawing from what the states are succeeding in.
Thank you. All right, my next question is for Chapa. We've heard a bit today and also in the August webinar about the importance of science-based decision-making and knowledge-based decision-making. And I'd like to hear from you as the director of Sea Grant in Puerto Rico and also a board member of Caracruz, where you work, as a nexus between ocean observers and local communities that depend on that information, but also really needs that information to be tailored to their specific needs. So can you describe an example where ocean observations are improving ocean biodiversity management on behalf of communities in Puerto Rico?
Sure, I would be glad to do that. The example that I picked from all our efforts is one that in Puerto Rico, we don't have curriculums or books that teach about our coastal ecosystems like coral reefs, mangrove areas, and marine grasses. So I told our education specialist if she could start developing curriculums for the schools from kinder to seniors in high school to teach them about our coastal and marine ecosystems, because if people don't know them, they will not care about its conservation and taking care of them. So we developed curriculums that have been adopted by the education department in Puerto Rico and in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And we are applying that knowledge in several schools. What we do is we have a pre-test, a post-test to measure the knowledge gain. We have the plans for the teachers, the presentations, and this information is provided to the students. Then we also take the teachers and make a workshop where we take them to the ocean and show them the coral reefs, the marine grasses, and the mangrove areas so that they can really teach to the students about a resource that they know. We have been very successful working with the Montessori public schools in Puerto Rico, specifically in one in La Parguera, which is a coastal community which was famous for fishing and fishermen, and now it's a nature reserve, a natural reserve. So we implemented the curriculums in that school, and the teachers were trained to use the curriculums. And then CARICUS, which is from IUS, is the Caribbean IUS branch in Puerto Rico. They had the idea of making a center, which is called CERCA, which means near or close, where we are giving the students, we have made a room at the school where they teach the community about what they learn about the ecosystems and about the tools that CARICUS has about tsunami warning, about hurricanes, about sea level rise. So the students are teaching now their parents and community members in those rooms and giving that information with all the data that is from the buoys in CARICUS and the radars. And it has been very successful. And now we're going to do it in other schools around our coastal areas.
Thanks so much for sharing that. That's a great example. And it's also great to hear about, the power of getting people outside and experiencing the resource to really make that book knowledge come alive. Okay, my next question is for Michelle, and this gets to the relationship between fisheries management and biodiversity conservation. There are obviously clear connections between those two, and yet policies around biodiversity conservation and fisheries management are sometimes at odds instead of reinforcing each other. So how can we build an ongoing dialogue using the National Biodiversity Strategy as a catalyst that can be different from what we've done in the past and maybe help us get past some of those barriers and foster better connections?
Thanks, Lauren, for the question. And, it's true that I think much of our fisheries management is typically focused on like single species management and single species approaches and extractions, even though our federal fisheries law provides for management of fish in complexes that sort of acknowledges the interconnection among species and biodiversity. We're still sort of required in many instances to establish things like, catch limits on an annual basis for single species within there. And so, but I do just want to note that one of the findings in our federal fisheries law is, to foster and maintain the diversity of fisheries within the United States. And so, to do that, we really need to support and maintain, biodiversity and the federal fishery management councils do have mandates to take into account, ecosystem considerations when thinking about things like, what is the optimum yield from a fishery? And so, these are sort of like very high level, policy constructs that are connected to biodiversity. But at a more practical level, I think, building a dialogue that is different, the National Ocean Biodiversity Strategy, I think the real need there is to establish connections with those things that fishing communities are most concerned about. So, this includes things like planning for resiliency in fishing businesses. Are people going to be able to continue to fish for the same species? And is it going to be, economically feasible? And so, I think some of the things in the strategy that are noted are the need to be able to track and predict, how ocean life is changing and shifting in response to climate change, which I mentioned earlier. And that's a huge concern in fisheries management, I think, particularly along the East Coast, where we have multiple federal fishery management councils, that have each taken slightly different approaches to, how we manage our fisheries. And, I think also the strategy notes, the need for effective economic valuation of ocean biodiversity. I think that's a really important point, recognizing that economic and cultural value and incorporating sort of, the future cost of what decreasing biodiversity could have on our fisheries, fishing communities. And so I think, to do something a little different, we really need to connect some of these larger scale policy efforts with, similar and related efforts in fisheries management, such as the climate change scenario planning process, which is, this multi-jurisdictional effort across all of the East Coast fishery management councils and the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. Things like NOAA's Climate, Ecosystem, and Fisheries Initiative. And so while these may not be very explicitly focused on biodiversity, we need to build connections between these initiatives because they really are linked. And I think there are so many high-level efforts underway, valuable high-level efforts underway, that it can be really difficult for folks to track and become involved in, and or understand, how does this affect me, and how should I be involved? And so I think focusing on explaining to folks how all of these efforts complement one another is really important, and that can be done graphically. It's really important to do it in plain language. There are just a lot of initiatives underway, and I think fatigue on the part of fishermen and fishing communities and stakeholders in general is a really real thing. And then I think maybe in terms of on-ramps and connection points, I think making a concerted effort to engage in and connect the strategy with some of the ongoing fisheries management processes is a really great start. So, for example, the Mid-Atlantic Council is currently undergoing a review and revision of our essential fish habitat designations. And so, that's been informed by this years-long effort to characterize marine fish habitat, which is called the Northeast Regional Marine Fish Habitat Assessment. They've developed this really amazing, data explorer tool that I think dovetails really nicely with the biodiversity strategy's focus on sharing of ocean biodiversity information. So I think, engaging in this ongoing process, bringing forward those, biodiversity tools to fisheries managers and fisheries participants is a fantastic opportunity. I think another one that I would mention would, and again, this is something that the Mid-Atlantic Council has done, is we have an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. And so, as part of that, we've developed a risk assessment to identify those elements or things that could impact our ability to meet our management objectives. And that includes, habitat protection, which is a very clear mandate of our federal fisheries law. And so, we've been engaged in this comprehensive review of that risk assessment. So, all of the risk elements, how do we define them? How do we track them? And how do we determine what levels of risk our indicators are telling us? So a lot of those elements dovetail really nicely with the national biodiversity goals. So, we have elements related to estuarine and coastal habitat, offshore habitat, ecosystem productivity, climate distribution shifts. And then some things that we're working on that I think are really relevant to this effort are population diversity and ecological diversity. And so those aren't really ready for prime time yet, but I think there's a great opportunity here to, integrate national biodiversity information, data sharing and priorities through that effort. So, and again, many of those are being developed through the state of the ecosystem reports, which NOAA fisheries staff put out. So I think there's, there are multiple on-ramps for, I think, integrating these different things. So I think I'll stop there. I could probably, like Jen was saying, do I have all the rest of the time? I could probably go on forever. There's a lot of other things that I'd be happy to address, but I think the point is that, as the implementation plan for the National Biodiversity Strategy is developed, I would really recommend looking to some of these ongoing fisheries related efforts and reaching out to those principles to make sure that we're all sharing information and integrating these efforts. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And I think your comments about connecting the dots really reflect a lot of the conversation we've had so far today about the ability to learn from each other, from different states and from indigenous ways of viewing the world, and the work that's happening in the Caribbean and in so many different places that we've heard from. So thanks for that. And I'm happy to say that we have time to go to questions from the audience. So I'm going to turn it over to Jason. Thank you all
Excellent.
so much.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you to all the panelists for such insightful comments and thoughtful answers to the questions. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions in the chat, and please do drop your questions in the Q&A so that we can get to them. The first question was about not hearing a lot about the discussion of history and historic inequities that have led to the exclusion of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous knowledge, and fisherfolk from conservation processes. Anastasia asked this question, and she heard a little bit from Jenn Eckerle about concrete ideas, learning through time, accepting less than perfection, but she was curious about the rest of the panel. Does the panel have any creative ideas about how the biodiversity strategy could address these historical injustices moving forward from just strategy for 30 by 30? So any thoughts or comments from the panel? Kawika?
Yeah, happy to jump in on that one. And thank you. That's such a great question. And so I'll go back to what I was speaking about in the context of restoration. So, you know, what some of us speak of, some of those historical injustices that, you know, trace back to colonization, U.S. policies such as Manifest Destiny, national parks, and all these things, which is really the genealogy of marine protected areas and those kinds of things. So I think when conservationists show up with these good intentions and creating marine protected areas, they don't see that by imposing marine protected areas, you're actually perpetuating this tool of colonization, which has been the severing of relationships between Indigenous peoples and their ancestral lands and waters. And so when I speak about restoration and biocultural restoration, you know, just by speaking about our relationships and endeavoring to restore those relationships to place, to lands, to waters, to biodiversity, that in itself is an act of addressing historical injustices. And so that's a lot of the work that we do in Hawaii. And there's a lot of folks around the nation who are also engaged in that kind of work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kawika. Dylan, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just add, that was a great answer. And so I'll just add a little bit on the state policy side that we've been seeing. And I think we've found in our network that a lot of state legislators are eager to learn more about how to approach this issue, but oftentimes don't exactly know how to best include or to have appropriate engagement with Indigenous communities and tribes. And so we've been working with some partners, including Native Americans in Philanthropy, on a public learning series for lawmakers. And so we've done 3 of them now, I believe, of really a tribal relations 101 and helping legislators understand different aspects of working directly with tribes and thinking about policy examples and ways that this has worked well, looking at things like tribal liaison roles and states that have set up good processes that have some productive outcomes. And so trying to figure out some of those policy or systems approaches that you can take in actually structuring policy. Some cases there's places like Maine where with some of their offshore wind council, they're ensuring that there's tribal representation. And I think some of those are kind of a starting point, definitely not a perfect solution, but I think it's something where there's a lot of emphasis in trying to find those right approaches. And finally, I think moving forward, trying to find some bigger shifts, like things like community benefits agreements and making sure that there's some really big shifts that take place, that policy ensures that Indigenous voices are part of this conversation and that there's recognition of everything that was already shared from Kawika and others to make sure that it's not just a continued extractive approach, but really thinking about the benefits and also the usage. I think we've seen that in a lot of different ways. There's things like the Land Water Conservation Fund at the federal level does not currently allow going directly to tribes. And so states like New Mexico, while not a coastal state, is opening up how tribes can be priorities recipients of that fund as it goes through the states. And so I think there's some interesting levers that states can play or pull to make sure that money, resources, agreements, and time are all going directly into Indigenous community hands to help execute some of these goals and stand up some of those biodiversity goals that are shared and really can be either co-led or fully Indigenous-led, depending on the situation.
Excellent. Thanks, Dylan. Thanks to you both for responding to that. Moving on, we had a couple of questions that were around climate change and range shift in certain species. Carlos had in the comment in the chat function, looking at how we deal with north-south gradients and actually sharing and transferring knowledge on these changing transboundary issues that climate is affecting. And another question by David in the Q&A was specifically focused on black sea bass and shifting rains because of climate change. So would the panel like to discuss any thoughts on how the strategy or some of the work that they've seen is addressing climate-induced shifts of species, especially if they affect biodiversity in certain regions that are unexpected or surprise?
I'll go ahead and jump in, Jason, on that one. Yeah. So I think black sea bass in particular, and maybe other species. I think NOAA has been working on like simulation studies and ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles that can try to help address those types of issues, and help us with our predictive capacity of what other variables might be related to the shift in distribution of a particular species. I think one of the things that is really more community knowledge based are things, and especially with respect to the sharing of knowledge on that north-south gradient, is that many of the fishery management councils develop what are called fishery performance reports. And so these are the participants in the fishery contributing their knowledge on an annual basis. What are you seeing that's different? How are ocean conditions different this year than they might have been, last year or in previous years? Are you seeing trends in changes? And so this is the kind of community knowledge I think is really valuable for, I think identifying in real time, those shifts in distribution, but also, being able to track them as well. Certainly, simulation studies can help us, think about what the potential effects are of, species like black sea bass, which, have really, as David indicated, exploded in southern New England. What are the implications of that, and how that might be affecting other species? So I think just a couple thoughts on that, and I'll let others jump.
Thanks, Michelle. Any other panelists have any reflections on that? Okay, let's move on. There's a question specifically from California. In the case of the Marine Life Protection Act, the law itself really was a force to get it done. How important is it to have these types of top-down mandated goals to achieve biodiversity across the US? Jen, I believe you're probably the first one to chime in, but anybody else from different regions, please do respond.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. I will say, like I kicked off my comments, I think it was really important to have kind of that direction in legislation. That being said, the design of our MPA network was deeply driven by community engagement, and I was a part of that in the Southern California region. We're sitting around a table with fishermen and members of tribes and others, like, what do we want to protect? What do we care about? What are the trade-offs? And so I think it is for California what that balance looks like, and that having kind of a directive that we at the highest level in California had a value to protect conservation, not only for the benefits it provides to ecosystems, but the benefits it provides to all of us, and the various reasons why we care about a healthy ocean, but then really embedding the decision-making and the long-term management within these community networks, and with support from government. So I think it's everybody together solution.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jen. Any other panelists want to talk about this topic from their region or from other regions? Gabrielle, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I think the question of a mandate is a really important one. And certainly it was something that we thought quite a lot about in developing the strategy, because we don't have a high level mandate that really drives and bolsters this work. Yes, this is a we're all in it together kind of initiative. That's what will get us to real solutions. But there's a need for mandates in law that call for us to come together. That would help to drive progress at the federal level and, in federal, non-federal partnerships for sure. So just reflecting, there's sort of this high level state level mandates, but also the need for, a national one that brings focus to this crisis, really.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Gabrielle. And we are at the top of the hour. We're out of time, but just wanted to reiterate just so much thanks and gratitude to all of our esteemed panelists for sharing their time and thoughts with us today. Unfortunately, Vera couldn't make it because of technical issues, but we will try to circle back with her after this. But thanks to those who could join us today. And thanks to many of you who joined and took your time out to listen to this important discussion. This event was recorded, so we will post it soon, just in case your colleagues couldn't make it. And if you had questions that we couldn't get to today, please reach out to Emily or myself afterwards, and we can follow up with you. Until next time, all, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for wonderful moderation by Lauren Wenzel and our colleagues, Gabrielle and Emmett, for putting this together with us. And we're really looking forward to future conversations and advancing this important work. So take care and have a lovely day, everybody.